Every ethical system eventually has to answer the same practical question. What do you actually do on a Wednesday afternoon when some difficult moral choice is in front of you and you're not really sure what the right move is supposed to be? Abstract principles are fine in that they educate us in a certain direction or make us think about things in a certain way, but principles don't apply themselves. They don't come with any distinct markers on how we're supposed to make our decisions. People ultimately have to do that for themselves, in specific contexts, with incomplete information, under pressure, in real time. Aristotle really understood this. In fact, it's probably one of his chief problems with the methods of Plato, which tended to focus on the abstract and the theoretical. Aristotle wanted to be more practical. He wanted a real-world application of moral reasoning. And that part of his theory is one of the largest reasons why his ethics has lasted so long. This episode, I want to try out some of Aristotle's answer to that sort of Wednesday afternoon problem. I want to look at the doctrine of the mean and the kind of practical wisdom that it ultimately requires of us. Welcome back to American Socrates. I'm Matt Rupert. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of Aristotle's theory here, I think it's good to take a step back and look at sort of a general overview of what it was that Aristotle was trying to get at. He has this concept that he tries to define for us called phronesis. Phronesis is action-oriented. It's not just knowing what is right, but it's also knowing how and why to apply it in a complex everyday scenario. I think that this is a huge problem for America today. We often hear things like racism is wrong. And that's true and theoretically correct. But it leaves out the question of what racism is in any specific context. I think most people understand that racism is wrong, but they don't understand it well enough to come to apply it when they really need to. So what we're trying to do here as part of this phronesis is not just understand what is right and what is wrong, but understand the context in which it survives. That whole complexity cannot be reduced down because if you don't have the full and complete understanding, you won't be able to orient yourself towards what is actually right. You'll become confused and miss the mark. Phronesis is also learned through experience, according to Aristotle. It can't be reduced to a rigid set of rules or scientific formulas. You don't get a list of do's and do nots. This is not a commandment. This is instead something that you can apply. It is a way of understanding moral reasoning so that in any given context, you can try to apply it and see how it holds. That's developed through life experience. It's developed through practice. It's developed through reflection. And ultimately, this is supposed to become a matter of habit for the ethical thinker. Phronesis also deals with the question of means and ends. A person who has phronesis has the ability to determine both the ultimate good, what they're supposed to pursue, and the most appropriate way to achieve it, the means to that end. So again, like I said in a couple episodes ago when we talked about the idea of teleology, we look for our ends. We need to identify our ends. That is still important. But once we have the end, we're really only a small portion of the way there. We now have to figure out how to actually achieve that end and what we need to do in order to make it correct. Aristotle develops the doctrine of the mean, which starts off with a kind of simple observation here that for almost any human behavior or response, there tends to be a deficiency, there tends to be an excess, and in that range, there tends to be an in-between that represents usually the most appropriate response. So virtue for Aristotle isn't like a rigid rule. It is not a, just do this or don't do this and everything will work out. It's a matter of trying to figure out on this spectrum, like how much of something you're supposed to do and how much you're supposed to leave off. And you have to have a good understanding of the situation you're in and a lot of knowledge about yourself, the kind of person that you are, your wants, your dispositions, in order to assess exactly where that mean is, that golden mean, that middle point that is between the faults or vices of too much and too little. Aristotle tends to use some pretty concrete examples. Courage, for example, is the mean that comes between cowardice, which is having too little willingness to face dangers, and a sense of foolhardiness or recklessness, which is having too much willingness to face danger. Generosity, as another example, is the mean between being a miser and being a spendthrift. Confidence could be the mean between self-depreciation and egotistic arrogance. In each of these cases, the virtue is not a point on a dial. It's in a range of appropriate responses, and they're all going to depend on context here. There's a right amount of ambitious for you to be in the world. If you're too ambitious, you're going to rub people the wrong way. You're going to upset them. You're going to demand things of them that's really unfair of you to demand. Of course, if you're not ambitious enough, you have a different set of problems. You're not going to ask for a raise when you totally deserve one. You're not going to assert your rights when they should be respected. And so if you have to find the right amount of ambition. There's no easy answers here. There's no, oh, just do this. It's all well and good to say things like, be yourself, find your passion, but those are empty ideals. If we're going to make this pragmatic, we're going to have a lot of understanding about who we are, how things work, what is possible, what is not possible, in order to make the best decisions for ourselves. There's two things that we need to establish pretty clearly here. The first one is that the mean is not the midpoint. It is not directly between the 2 points. That's not the goal. Aristotle's not trying to tell us to split the difference, to take a moderate position on everything, to avoid any sense of strong feeling. The mean is relative to the situation and to the person. The right amount of anger in response to a genuine injustice might be considerable. The right amount of fear when facing real danger may be significant. The mean is not a bland spot that just happens to be right dead in the middle between two different things. It is the appropriate response, which, again, sometimes requires intensity and sometimes requires restraint. The other thing that I want to establish is that virtue is supposed to be a disposition and not a cold calculation. Aristotle is not asking you to sit down before every decision that you make and work out some kind of arithmetic of excess and of deficiency here. What he's trying to do is describe what a person with good character, how they're going to look at things from the inside. Someone who has developed through their practices the tendency to respond appropriately without having to deliberate or scratch their head every time. The mean is where good character just naturally lands, not where careful calculation arrives. This could be a problem for us and for Aristotle's theory, but it's his way of trying to deal with the fact that we don't often have the time to sit down and carefully and meticulously reason our way through problems. Sometimes we have to make snap decisions. If you're the right kind of person who's had a good education and you understand a great number of things, you're probably going to make better snap decisions than other people. So the problem that Aristotle's trying to face down here is the idea that the extremes are almost always easier to occupy than this sort of middle ground, this golden mean. And this is worth looking into because it explains a lot about how people really behave when they have to make very quick, under pressure decisions. Extremes are easy because they don't require much judgment from us. If we have a rule that simply says, never show anger, then that really doesn't require any assessment of the situation. You just never show anger. You're never allowed to be angry. You always have to bottle it up and keep it inside. A policy of always standing your ground, on the other hand, requires no reading of the context. The mean is what is going to require us to actually look at what is happening, to make a particular kind of judgment call that's not always going to be universal, that will sometimes break the rule or bend the rule. And that's a lot harder to do than following a simple guideline or fixed rule. It carries the risk with it as well of being wrong in a way that rule following does not. If we're just following the rules, then even if it ends up turning out incredibly bad, it doesn't matter, we were following the rules. In this case, nope, that would still be bad. If it turned out really bad, then you were misapplying the rule. Extremes under this sort of way of looking at ethics also feel more principled to us. There's a particular kind of moral self-satisfaction that's available to people who hold really extreme positions. A sense that they are at least being consistent in all times, that they can't be accused of situational flip-flopping or compromising their values or something like that. They can pride themselves on the fact that they're hardliners. The person who's always generous can't be called stingy. The person who always defers to authority cannot be called insubordinate. But the cost of this consistency is that it tends to produce obviously wrong results, generally in cases where the extreme clearly doesn't fit. But because the person is insulated from those results, it protects them from any kind of discomfort or any kind of self-evaluation. Extremes are also easier to perform. In a culture that rewards visible moral commitment, extreme positions are legible in a way that nuanced positions really aren't. It's a kind of virtue signaling or moral signaling that performs for people something that they can then hold up and show to other people about how morally righteous or how morally good they are. The performance of extremism is incredibly straightforward. It's the mean that's actually really hard to perform because it looks different situation by situation. You could even accuse those people of flip-flopping, as I said earlier. But that's going to make it hard for us to read this person as being good because we're going to have to also understand the complexities of the judgments that they made in order to judge them on how well they did. So the sort of practical consequence that falls out of all this is that people under social pressure, which is most of the people most of the time, tend to drift towards these legible extremes rather than towards an appropriate mean. This is not a moral failing. It's a predictable response to a certain set of incentives. And Aristotle's ethics is going to ask us to resist our tendencies to go extreme because oftentimes they're not going to be right. So back to that idea of phronesis. The doctrine of the mean would ultimately be kind of useless without having this capacity to identify where the mean actually is in a given situation. So phronesis is this kind of practical wisdom, or it's a sense of prudence. It's kind of a master virtue in his ethics, one that makes all the others function correctly. Practical wisdom should not be confused with theoretical knowledge here. This is not about knowing the rules or having all of the ends laid out in front of you. It's the ability to perceive what the situation is actually requiring of you individually and how you should respond to that accordingly. It's the difference between knowing that courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness and the ability to recognize in a specific situation what specific pressures or specific stakes and what that courageous response would actually look like then. What would you need to do to be courageous in this moment? A lot of people out there, will do something that fits in with their tribe. They're signaling their righteousness by saying, I'm doing the things that are expected of me, and it makes them feel like they're courageous. I'm taking a hard stand against people that my religion condemns. My religion doesn't like these people, and so I'm going to show how much I don't like them too. That's not moral courage. Moral courage would look something more like challenging your own members of your own religion because you're not sure whether they're right or not. That takes courage because now you understand that there's a personal risk to you by alienating yourself from your in group. So we get this wrong quite often. It takes a lot of deep thinking and a lot of understanding to realize how these virtues are supposed to play out. Aristotle's pretty clear that practical wisdom can't be taught through principles. It develops through experience or through the practice of making decisions. We observe the results, and gradually over time, we develop a more accurate perception of what different situations might require of us. Young people, he basically says, are very bad at this. And while they understand the concept of courage, say intellectually, they don't really have the practical wisdom to consistently act courageously in the different circumstances. They just simply lack experience. The concept and the capacity then for Aristotle are very different things. You have a certain understanding that this is the way things are, but the ability to put that into practice comes later and is much more difficult. So practical wisdom involves reading situations accurately. It involves not just what is happening on the surface, but what's actually deep down at stake. A person with practical wisdom doesn't respond to the category of a situation that they fall into. They have to respond to the situation itself because each situation is going to be unique. It involves knowing yourself accurately, your own tendencies towards excess or deficiency in certain places. Some places you're going to tend to overshoot. Other places you're going to tend to undershoot. And if you know this about yourself, you can adjust and make accommodations. Aristotle notes that because we're not perfectly calibrated, practical wisdom sometimes requires deliberately aiming off-center. If you know you tend towards anger, for example, you're going to have to correct for that by tending to aim towards less anger than might feel natural for you. Or vice versa. If you tend towards meekness, you don't assert yourself when you should, then that feeling, defending yourself and actually just kind of coming to normal is going to feel to you like you're being outrageously angry, preposterously angry, when in fact you're just simply holding your boundaries. Self-knowledge is a massive component then of this kind of practical wisdom. It is not a separate virtue unto itself. And all of this involves a sense of timing, too. The right response delivered at the wrong moment is frequently not the right response. When to speak, knowing when to stay silent, when to push, and maybe when to let something go. Those are timing judgments that no actual rule could ever make for you because they can't read the situation. So I want to try to make this a little bit more concrete by going through a couple of examples and just working through them with Aristotle. That way you can see sort of how this is supposed to work. Let's start with the idea of anger. Aristotle probably has more to say about anger than almost any other philosopher that I know of. His position is also more nuanced than most. He doesn't say that we should suppress our anger. He doesn't say that we should express it freely either. He says that the person of good character is going to feel the right amount of anger at the right things at the right time and direct that anger towards the right people. That way they can express their anger in the right way. And each one of those qualifications is going to matter here. We could be deficient in our anger. We could have too little anger. And that's going to be one problem. A person who feels no anger at, say, the injustice of another because it doesn't affect them, or at someone else's cruelty, or at betrayal, is not being a virtuous person. They're either too numb, they're too cowardly, or they're so committed to a certain kind of performance of equanimity that they have disconnected themselves from their own moral responses. Aristotle might call this person spiritless, and he's going to treat this as a kind of failure, not a virtue. Just taking an even strain and stepping outside of everything is not a virtue for Aristotle. You have to be engaged. You have to be passionate. You should be red in the face when you see one person treating another with injustice, even though it has nothing to do with you. Of course, there's an excess of anger too. If you have chronic, disproportionate, or misdirected anger, this is going to corrode relationships. It's going to impair judgments. It's going to make a person a poor reader of situations because everything gets processed through that same overheated lens. I think about this a lot, the way we often blame victims. We will look at a situation, we will see that there's been an injustice, we'll see that something's wrong here, and our first thought is to defend the perpetrator and to blame the victim for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or dressing the wrong way, or acting in a manner that maybe they shouldn't have acted that way, and that gives someone else the right to beat them or something like that. This victim blaming is a sort of excess of anger. You're not angry appropriately because you're not even angry at the right person. Perhaps you feel you can't be. Perhaps the person that committed the crime is in your family or on your team or part of your political ideology or your religion. And if that's the case, then you tend to blame the victim when your side transgresses. The mean then here is not the absence of anger. It is anger that is calibrated appropriately, that's present when it's warranted, that's proportional to the situation you find yourself in, that's directed at the right target, that's expressed in a way that serves a purpose rather than just maybe discharging a feeling. Let me give one more quick example. Truth. There's a right amount of truthfulness that Aristotle is going to insist that you become. You can be too truthful with people, in which case you tend to be somewhat callous. You're not really taking any tact with people. You are blunt in a way that's not necessarily productive or helpful. Telling someone that they have an ugly face, even though there's nothing they can do about their face. That's just their face. It's not their fault. They were born with it, whatever. Being that kind of truthful doesn't win you any friends, but it does earn you a kind of distancing that people don't want to be around. You can be not truthful enough as well. You can gain a reputation for misunderstanding or spreading falsehoods or manipulating people. If you're not trustworthy in this way, again, people don't want to listen to you. They would rather avoid you. So you have to read the situation as to how best to bring about the truth. You should have a respect for the truth, and you should want to bring truth into your conversations and your relationships. But when and how and why are all very important considerations depending on each and every circumstance. So hopefully between these two, you get at least some picture of what Aristotle is trying to accomplish with this idea of the mean and trying to make a practical way for you to apply virtue and goodness in your daily life. There are, of course, limitations to what this doctrine of the mean can really do. It is a practical tool. It's not a universal solve. One of the things that it can't do is it can't resolve genuine moral dilemmas. When we have two legitimate values that are in direct conflict with each other, say loyalty versus honesty, or a sense of justice versus a sense of mercy, or an individual good versus a collective good. The doctrine of the mean isn't going to do a very good job at telling us which of those values should take precedence. It's going to tell you how to express whichever value you act on, but not which one you should really take. So some decisions are going to require a different kind of moral reasoning than the mean can really provide us. And we can use that moral reasoning in order to make a judgment call and then feel a certain way about it based on virtue ethics. Another thing that is a limitation for Aristotle's virtue ethics is that it can be used to rationalize problems. The claim that you're occupying a virtuous mean between two extremes is available to almost anyone about almost anything. The person who is genuinely reckless can describe their cowardly opponents as deficient in the extreme and themselves as moderately courageous. The doctrine requires an accurate perception of where the extremes actually in fact lie, which requires a lot of practical wisdom the doctrine is supposed to produce. In other words, you have to already kind of have a pretty extensive education, or you're going to have to trust people who do. This is not going to work if you're really ignorant about where you lie and what the positions are. There's a sort of circularity here that Aristotle does acknowledge, which is part of why he insists practical wisdom only develops through experience and you really can't take any kind of shortcut. A third thing that is problematic about this position is that it is very much culturally situated. And what that means is that what counts, what is seen as an appropriate mean in one community might be seen more as an excess or a deficiency in another. Aristotle is aware of this, at least to some degree, but he doesn't really fully resolve it. The mean is supposed to give you a structure for moral reasoning within a given context. It doesn't by itself tell you whether the context is actually one that's worth adapting to. So the short of that is that there's a relationship here between ethics and politics that we're going to have to examine if we're going to apply this theory accurately. So to wrap up, Aristotle's golden mean isn't really a formula. It's a description of what good judgment should look like. It's responsive to the situation. It's calibrated to the individual. It's developed through experience rather than derived from the rules. It's practical in the most literal sense. It is the kind of thinking that actually helps you decide what to do on Wednesday afternoon when something difficult is staring you in the face. The two things it really requires of you are an accurate perception of the situation and an accurate self-knowledge. And those are both things you develop over time, which means the person with more experience and more honest self-reflection is far better equipped to find the mean than the person who simply knows the theory or doesn't have much experience. Aristotle's ethics is not for beginners in the sense of being simple. It is for beginners in the sense of being somewhere you start and then can get better at, rather than a system that you ultimately master and then apply it accurately. So the question that I want to leave you with is that in the areas of your life where you consistently either overshoot or undershoot, where you know your responses tend to either be too much or too little, what would it take for you to start to correct your aim? To start to realize I need to do things a little differently? I'm not talking about eliminating certain responses, but calibrating those responses so that they're more appropriate. Because that calibration, practiced over time, is what Aristotle means by virtue.
Thanks for tuning in to American Socrates. If today's episode of Philosophy got you thinking in new ways, make sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. New, full episodes drop every Wednesday. If you enjoyed the show, leave a review. It helps others find us, and it means a lot. And if you know someone who could use a little more practical wisdom in their life, share this episode with them. Until next time, keep questioning everything.